All right. It's dot 9 o'clock as per the Indian Standard Time, and you're good to go. Good day, everyone. My name is Sankalp Bhora, and I'm a master's student studying philosophy at Ashoka University. I welcome all of you to this philosophy workshop titled Locating Subjectivity in the Study of Consciousness, organized by the Department of Philosophy at Ashoka University. Now, I'm assuming most of you were also in attendance for the previous two talks of our workshop, but in case you're joining us for just this workshop, just a brief introduction about our university. Ashoka University is one of India's leading liberal arts and sciences universities, and it has been ranked in the top 5 among private universities in India by QS Asia, and has also secured top rank among all Indian universities in the International Faculty Indicator. In a very limited time, Ashoka has built itself a reputation for having strong emphasis on research output and academic excellence. This workshop consists of 3 talks, and this is the final talk, by very eminent philosophers from around the world. And the workshop aims to bring together various perspectives on the topic of consciousness and subjectivity with a hope to further the discussion about topics such as introspection, self, and perception, which are at the heart of issues pertaining to the subjectivity of conscious experience. The speaker for the final talk of our workshop would not need much of an introduction to those who are in the field of philosophy, but nevertheless, here's a humble attempt at an introduction. Ned Block is the Silver Professor of Philosophy and Psychology at New York University, prior to which he was the chair of the philosophy program at MIT. His research interests primarily lie in the philosophy of perception and the foundations of neuroscience and cognitive science. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a fellow of the Cognitive Science Society, and has been a Guggenheim Fellow. He's also a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of Language and Information, and a Sloan Foundation Fellow at the University of California, Berkeley. Among the various prizes and awards that Professor Block has won, he's won the John Nickert Prize, and he's also won the 2021 Dr. Martin R. Leibowitz and Eve Leibowitz Prize for Philosophical Achievement and Contribution, jointly with Ted Phillips. The Philosopher's Annual has selected his papers as one of the 10 best in 1983, 1990, 1995, 2002, and 2010. It's an honor to be hosting you, Professor Block. Before Professor Block begins his talk, just a few housekeeping points to note. After Professor Block finishes his presentation, Professor Rajaroshnagan will present a commentary on the presentation, after which the floor will be open for a question and answer session. Please keep your questions short and crisp for the benefit of the speaker and for the audience. During the talk, kindly keep your mics in mute, and if possible, kindly switch on your camera, for it makes for a more interactive and engaging session. This session is being recorded and will be posted on the university's YouTube channel for those who aren't able to join us on today's call. With that, Professor Block, the floor is yours.
See, am I unmuted? Yes. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and I'll just get started because I only have a half an hour. So this is an hour talk, which I have compressed into a half an hour, so I'm going to have to leave some of it out. The idea of the talk is to give an empirical argument that perception is non-conceptual. Let me say first what I mean by a concept. A concept, in the way I'm using the term, is a way of thinking. So famously, Oedipus had 2 ways of thinking of Jocasta, which he later found out coincided. By thinking, what I mean is cognition broadly construed, including evaluation, decision, expectation, reasoning, problem solving, working memory. Most of what I'm going to be talking about is going to be expectation, but the same points apply to all of these. Notably, there can be perceptual concepts that involve a perceptual way of thinking, and there can be 2 perceptual concepts of the same thing. For example, when we see a glass of water and we feel it at the same time. We have two concepts of the circularity of the water, of the glass. So I'm going to be my main argument is going to be dependent on an example from the development of concepts and perception in children. So I'm going to be talking about infants, and what I'm going to argue is that between 4 to 6 months they get color category representations. By 11 to 12 months they get color concepts, and by 3 years they get linguistic color concepts. So there's a three-way distinction here, and what's going to be important is this intermediate period between 4 to 6 months and 11 to 12 months. So here is the period. That's a 4-month-old. This is a 12-month-old, and it's this period that I'm going to be talking about. And that period, there's color perception without deployment of color concepts. That's the key idea. So I'm going to start with infants' color discrimination, move to their not normally noticing colors. Then I'll talk about color working memory, color language, the difference among these different categories. And then I'll move to adult color perception and adult perception more generally. So categorical perception, as everyone knows, the rainbow is a continuous band of wavelengths, but it looks like stripes. And that's categorical perception. We categorize certain segments of that wavelength band. And there's a behavioral reflex of this, which is that there's faster and more accurate discrimination between colors that are across different categories than the same wavelength separation within a category. I'm going to be talking about the work of Anna Franklin, who has shown a lot about color perception in infants. And of course, these infants can't talk, so they can't tell you whether they're perceiving the colors. So you need nonverbal methods of finding out. One nonverbal method that works extremely well is you just show them a uniform expanse with a disk of a different color. And then if they see it as a different color, they just move their eyes to it. And adults do that too, or you tend to move your eyes to it. And that's a way of gauging whether they really do see it as a different color. Also, you can judge color categories that way because they move their eyes more quickly if this and this are in different color categories. And so we can use that as a gauge to detect their categories. That's one nonverbal method. A second nonverbal method is the method of habituation. This is the very first habituation apparatus. This is a psychologist named Robert Fantz. And he's looking down into a device. This is an infant looking up, and he's projecting images on a screen, and then he's looking at where the infant is looking. And what he showed was, for example, that infants like to look at faces. So this is the time they spent looking at the image and the time they spent looking around. So they'll look longer at faces than at letters. This is a shorter time, and so on. A more modern method is you have a camera at the top of a screen, and the baby is sitting there, and somebody looking through that camera can judge where the infant is looking. And this method can be used in the following way. If you show the infant same color, same color, same color, same color, the infant will lose interest and look away from the screen. But then if there's a different color, something that the infant experiences as a different color, on one side, the infant will look to that side or be more likely to look to that side. And then if you switch sides, the infant will be more likely to look to that side. And you can use this novelty preference, so-called, to judge the color categories. So summarizing a lot of data, infants all over the world have 5 color categories. This is a diagram. The lines between the boxes indicate same category. The gaps between the boxes indicate these are in different color categories. So this kind of orangish, brown, yellowish, green category is distinct from a greenish category in infants all over the world. And these match moderately well to most language groups. So just to summarize, 6 to 11-month-olds have nearly adult levels of color discrimination. They move their eyes to what they see as a different color. They're bored by the same color. They look to the side with a new color. And there's a third method that yields the same categories called an oddball effect, which I don't really have time to talk about. Now, infants 6 to 11-month-olds do not normally notice color. Here is an experiment that shows that. This is Wilcox, 1999. So a green ball rolls towards an occluder, slowly disappears behind the occluder, and then a red ball emerges on the other side. Adults and adult monkeys see the sequence as a green ball turning into a red ball, if the screen is sufficiently narrow and the movement is sufficiently continuous. An old article, when people actually described what subjects said, describes a compelling impression of continuous and uniform movement. It's called the tunnel effect. Now, interestingly, 4.5-month-olds show increased looking time, indicating surprise, if a ball turns into a box, but not if a red ball turns into a green ball. They don't seem to notice anything odd if a red ball turns into a green ball. At 7.5 months, they show surprise if something of one kind turns into something of another kind, like a duck turns into a truck, but still not color. It takes till 11.5 months before they are surprised at a change in color. So they do not normally notice color. Normally, and I'm talking about normally here always, they see colors without noticing colors. Now, here's an objection. Maybe they have a concept of color as a temporary property of things, a property that comes and goes. Rebuttal. So an experiment by Kimura et al., 2010, showed infants things of different colors, oddball colors. And what they found was that 6 to 8-month-olds prefer to look at the normal colored fruits and vegetables, but when it came to flowers, they didn't have any preference, suggesting that they really did have an expectation for normal colors of things. Maybe the infants can have another objection. Maybe they can have a concept or a proto-concept of color with training. And I think this objection is right. They can have, I think probably not a concept, but a proto-concept. And here's Wilcox, the same person who did this, did training. So 2 rounds of training for a 9.5-month-old. The training involved giving different functions to different colors. A pounding function to the green cup and a pouring function to the red cup. With 3 rounds of training, 7.5-month-olds looked longer at the change of color. So here's a better view of the training, and here's a still better view of the training. Pounding with the green cup and pouring with the red cup. So something seems to happen around 9 months, because at 9 months, the training transferred from red, green to yellow, blue, and it didn't transfer before that. So here's the main point here, is that training can lead infants under 11 months to notice color, but it does not follow that before training, they have concepts or proto-concepts of color as a temporary property of things, or after training either. So here's the logic of it. Infants normally have no concept or proto-concept of color. Normally, they don't have a conceptual color perception. So that's the point I'm trying to make about what they normally have or don't have. So they can have a proto-concept of color with training, but there are two possibilities: that they can have a proto-concept of color in perception, or that they can have color cognition with non-proto-conceptual color perception. And I'm going to argue for this one. So I think they never have conceptual or proto-conceptual color perception. So now let me go back to the objection that maybe they have a concept of color as a temporary property of things. So I'm now going to show you 3 experiments in which demonstrate failure of color cognition in infants in this intermediate period before 12 months, or before 11 to 12 months. So in this experiment, it was shown, so the baby sees this, something on the left, something on the right. And if the thing on the left and the thing on the right have the same shape, like both discs or both triangles, that predicts an interesting event, like a jumping frog that makes a noise on one side or the other. And what Hochman did in this experiment was arrange it so that after repeated presentations, there was a rule which the infant could abstract. Same shape predicts something interesting, say on the left side. And under 12 months, they could learn this one, but they could not learn this one, that same color predicts something interesting. So this is a failure of the use of color in formulating an expectation. Now notice that even if color were conceived as a temporary property of things, same color at a time predicts something interesting, and they couldn't learn that. So there's an interesting feature of this that differs from the tunnel effect, which is this requires working memory. Working memory is a kind of scratch pad that's required in order to reason. So for example, to go from P and if P then Q, you need working memory because you need to hold these both in memory. And working memory this is the front of the brain, this is the back of the brain. Working memory is controlled by this area, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and it maintains connections with perceptual areas in the back of the head. So here's another working memory experiment that shows that infants can't use color to formulate expectations. In this experiment, an object of one shape or color comes out of a screen and then goes back behind the screen. And then another object of a certain shape or color goes out and goes back. And then the screen goes up and you can see something that violates shape expectation. Instead of a disc and a triangle, you have 2 discs. And infants are surprised at that. They look longer at that. But if this is a red thing going out and going back and a green thing going out and going back, they're not surprised by 2 red things or 2 green things. They don't expect a red and a green thing until 12 months. So before 12 months, they're not using color to formulate an expectation about what will be there when the screen goes up. A similar experiment, a whole series of experiments by Zhu and Carey and others, is about number. So you have a screen, an object comes out one side and goes back, an object comes out the other side and goes back. And then the question is, do they expect two things? Here's a more graphical version of it. One color, another color, screen goes up. Under 12 months, they don't expect two things. But they do expect two things if they're different shapes or different kinds. And they are able to do that months earlier than they can use color. So the upshot from both of these and the earlier experiment I mentioned is that between 6 to 11 months, infants normally do not notice color, and they have no color representations in working memory that allow them to formulate expectations, and hence no color concepts or proto-concepts. So that's the main point. They can't have conceptual color perception because they don't have color concepts at all, or at least they don't show any sign of color concepts in a wide variety of experiments. So that's the argument, that there is no conceptual color perception in these infants. To further bolster that conclusion, I'm going to talk about color language. Okay, on the average, children know 4 basic color words by the age of 3 years, 3 months. This is more than 2 years after they first start to get some appreciation of color. And it shows how difficult color conceptualization is for children. I should say that this experiment was done, I forgot to mention the experiment, which is Mabel Rice took a group of 2 to 3-year-olds who didn't know any color words to teach them the difference between red and green. For most of these children, learning this difference took over 1,000 trials over several weeks. And many parents have noticed how difficult it is to teach children color words, and that they don't seem to use color. It takes until well after a year old that they start to use color to distinguish your toy from my toy. So Charles Darwin said the following: I attended carefully to the mental development of my own children, and with 2, or as I believe 3 of them, soon after they had come to the age when they knew the names of all common objects, I was startled by observing that they seemed quite incapable of affixing the right names to the colors in colored engravings, although I tried repeatedly to teach them. I distinctly remember declaring that they were color blind. And this difficulty that children have was called Farbendummheit by a German researcher in 1906. That's color stupidity. Now, I should say that in IQ tests in Europe, in the early 20th century, showed that children did not get the 4 basic color words, red, green, yellow, and blue, until they were around 7. By 1980, it was 3 years, 3 months. And it probably has something to do with the fact that children get so many plastic colored things, whereas, in Darwin's time, in terms of permanent artifacts, there were fewer of them with less bright colors. So I'm going to say a little more about color categories, color concepts, and linguistic concepts. So remember, it's this period that I'm talking about. And you might ask, well, why aren't color categories a kind of concept? And the answer is, I'm just using the term to mean concept, that is, to be anchored to a role in thought or reasoning, but this is just terminology. The main thing is there is an enormous difference between this age and this age, in that they are, at this age, they have color cognition that they do not have at this age. And it's that the representations involved in color cognition that I'm talking about. Let me move now to the more difficult topic of adult color perception. So to explain this, you need to know that this is a diagram of the outlines of the visual system. Light comes in, irradiates the retina. It goes to an intermediate place in the middle of the head called the lateral geniculate nucleus, and then it goes to the first stage of visual cortex, which is, surprisingly for many people, is in the back of the head. So the very first stage of color processing is not in the front of the head, as you might think, it's in the back of the head. Importantly, the left visual field feeds to the right hemisphere. This is a slice of the brain, and the right side of both retinas feeds to the right hemisphere, and same for the right visual field to the left hemisphere. So you need to know that. So we might ask about adult concepts of color. Now, here's a diagram that shows the within category and between category initiation of movement time for the case that I mentioned earlier with the uniform screen with a disk of a different color. And what this shows is that if you have two shades of blue, that's within category, it takes longer, about 800 milliseconds, to move your eyes from a background of one shade of blue to a disk of another shade of blue, as compared with blue versus green or red versus yellow. So it's a couple hundred milliseconds shorter if they're different color categories. But this is only in the left visual field controlled by the right hemisphere in infants. The right visual field doesn't show that. And what this shows is that statistically there's no difference in the right visual field at all. These are error bars. However, for adults, there's a left visual field advantage in both. Sorry, there's a within category advantage within both the left and the right visual field, showing categorical perception in both hemispheres. So you might suppose, well, what's happened in adults is they've got conceptual color perception replacing the non-conceptual color perception. We can distinguish between three possibilities: that in adults, there's a replacement of non-conceptual categories with concepts. There's preservation of non-conceptual categories, but modified maybe by top-down influence. Or maybe adults have both non-conceptual and conceptual color perception. So I'm going to argue for this middle one, which is that adults continue to have non-conceptual color perception, maybe modified by top-down influence. And I'm going to give you two experiments that support that. This experiment, done by a group in Oxford last year, showed subjects, these are called Gabor patches, these I'll call them grids of different colors and different orientations, to make sure, and they could be any one of these colors, to make sure that the subjects carefully looked at the colors. After a certain amount of time, 700 milliseconds, they had a color wheel on the left or a color wheel on the right. And the subject's task was to move a cursor, if it was on the left, to move a cursor to this color, on the right, to move a cursor to this color. Or they could have a grid, and then the idea would be to move the grid so that it matched the orientation. And while subjects were doing this, they had an EEG mesh on their head to look at the brain activations. And what what they were trying to do is to see which areas of the brain correlated with the colors that they were seeing. And what they found was that for a left stimulus, it's the back of the head and the right. Right stimulus back of the head and the left, and same thing for orientation. It was the back of the head on the opposite side called contralateral. And what they didn't get, this is a head, these are ears, this is the nose. What they did not find was decoding from brain areas underlying language or concepts. That would be the front of the head or the left side. So here are the main brain areas, language brain areas on the left side of the brain. This is the back, this is the front. This is, for those of you who know about this, this is a complex involving Wernicke's area, and this is Broca's area. These are on the left side, but you're not seeing, this is completely dark. They could get no decoding from the classic language areas, suggesting that even though languages do differ in how they categorize colors, this wasn't appearing in color perception itself. So there's nothing there, and nothing in the prefrontal cortex where you would expect concepts to be. So they say activity in posterior electrodes, that's the back of the head, contralateral to the decoded stimulus, were the primary contributors to the decoding of both features, that is, color and orientation, suggesting that visual sensory processing was the main source of decodable signals, ruling out alternative explanations such as verbal labeling. In addition, this all happened rather quickly, between 150 and 350 milliseconds. This is the peak of decoding, and that is before concepts come into play, which doesn't happen until around perhaps in the very beginning, 270 milliseconds. So back of the head, contralateral, fast. So the most interesting cases now let me move to a different, well, I'm running out of time, so I may have to skip this. I'll skip this. Sorry about that. So I'm sorry, I don't have time to present all of the evidence. Anyway, the evidence I didn't present and what I did present suggests preservation of non-conceptual categories modified by top-down influence. So just to summarize, infants can see colors at nearly adult levels at 4 to 6 months, and they perceptually categorize colors. They can use shape, size, and kind information. I didn't mention the size, but that's also the case. Informing expectations and as inputs to rules 6 months earlier than they normally use color information. 2 years later, they don't know the basic color words. And I didn't mention this, but substantial reasoning with color seems to happen at the same time as learning the color words. So the point is that 6 to 11-month-old infants have color perception without color concepts, and there is some evidence that adults have non-conceptual color perception too. Now, this doesn't speak to adult perception, so-called high-level perception or perception of objects, but that's another story. So let me just ask the question, though, why is this important? Especially, why is it important for philosophers? So first of all, it's important if you want to understand the architecture of the mind. If perception were to be, contrary to what I've argued, conceptual, then the difference between cognition and perception might not be as fundamental as one thought. It's also relevant to robot vision. If perception is non-conceptual, then a robot whose camera fed directly into cognition would not be seeing. It would appear to be seeing, but it wouldn't really be seeing. And it's also relevant to epistemology. If perception is conceptual, the epistemology of perceptual belief is just we believe what we see. And there's a simple inferential story about the justification of perceptual belief. But if it's non-conceptual, we need a completely different model. And I took an extra minute, but I hope that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for that wonderful talk. And yeah, like it's not an issue with respect to time at all. Now, I would introduce Professor Rajaroshnagan, who will be presenting a commentary on Professor Block's presentation. Professor Rosenhagen is the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs and the Head of Department of Philosophy at Ashoka University. He's also an assistant professor over here. He has earned his PhD in philosophy in 2018 from the University of Pittsburgh, and he holds a MA from the University of Munster in philosophy, Indian studies, and psychology. Professor Rosenhagen's broad interests look at the philosophy of mind, especially perception, metaphysics, epistemology, philosophy of science, history of philosophy, and philosophy of love. And with that, over to you, Professor Rosenhagen.
Thank you, Sankar, and thank you, Ned, for this fascinating talk. I had the opportunity to watch the. Oh, am I audible? Check that.
Oh, you are audible, Professor.
Okay, so I had the opportunity to watch the longer talk. So whatever was not said, I could sort of pick up on that. I don't think it makes much of a difference to what I want to say. So let me get started. Ned Block's main target in his talk is to establish the view that perception is non-conceptual. This, I take it, is distinct from the question whether perception has or lacks content, since content could be non-conceptual. Now, before I raise my questions, I should probably confess that those empirical data were that was quite interesting. But I should confess that I'm mostly happy to agree that there are perfectly viable accounts of perceptual experience on which it is non-conceptual. However, I want to also state, second, that there are perfectly viable accounts on which perceptual experience also has no content. I don't mean acquaintance accounts. Third, I'm also happy to concede that there can be perfectly viable accounts of perceptual experience on which experience is conceptual. Finally, I'm not quite as happy to have to confess that I really don't have a very good idea of how to decide between them. So I'll explain why I hold this particular view shortly. But before I do, you'll imagine that given this particular predicament that I find myself in, my interest was piqued when Ned said that so far there had only been, maybe this didn't come up in this talk, only been armchair arguments for his main claim, and that he would now present an argument based on empirical evidence. But this really brings me to my first question, which is having an argument based on empirical evidence especially good, especially great? Is it it's a commonplace that empirical evidence, like any observation, is always in need of interpretation, contextualization, and so on, that such interpretations are always fraught with assumptions that can then be contested. Empirical studies are almost never conclusive, and this situation becomes epistemically more pressing, even if one thinks, as that does, that cognitive penetration is not just a theoretical possibility, but actual. If one thinks that experience can indeed be modified by background beliefs, do we now also need to rule out that whatever empirical evidence we draw on is not epistemically downgraded or somehow infected by our background beliefs? Well, a different way of putting the question is whether we should prefer arguments that are based on empirical evidence over armchair arguments, especially in light of the fact that questions regarding the interpretation of empirical results inevitably throw us back into the armchair, I want to say. The second question, and relatedly, is this. The account provided, it seems to me, rests on the assumption that what nudges something from being the mere having of a category indicated by a certain capacity to discriminate different stimuli reliably to the noble status of being a concept, or having a concept, is usability in working memory. My second question is this, and in the video, I think you say that this is an assumption that you import from cognitive science. So why should we accept it? And even if we accept it, why should we infer from the fact that there is no actual use in working memory that we have or will detect to the fact that there is nothing there that could be used in principle? Now that's the inference, I think, in the other talk you call it, from the absence of evidence to evidence of absence. But if concepts are characterized as involving, and I think that's, again, we may not have had this here, as involving actual or potential cognition, then the evidence provided seems to me is in principle compatible with the idea that children between 6 and 11 months do have color concepts. They simply don't care about colors that much, or getting excited or active about them only in specific circumstances, such as perhaps when color codes for something they are really interested in, such as certain functions like pounding or pouring, or if someone relentlessly torments them with 1,000 or more trials. There's only potential cognition, no actual cognition, perhaps, but on the notion of concept provided, that seems to suffice for them to have a concept. Again, that's sort of a lame, I take that to be a lame kind of question in a sense, because one could now play around with the notion of concept here to escape this consequence. But and I think that's just true, but that so much hinges on the notion of concept employed here, seems to me is another instance of the fact that by asking how to interpret empirical results, we can't really escape the armchair, especially if we have to settle on a notion of the conceptual first before we can take empirical results one way or another. Third and last question concerns the question why the main thesis that perception is non-conceptual is so important, and that came up at the very end of the talk. I agree that if we had an answer, this could allow us to make headway on some rather interesting questions concerning the architecture of the mind, as was pointed out. For yes, there are interesting metaphysical questions about the relation between perception and cognition. Is there a joint in nature that separates them or not? But again, with respect to these metaphysical questions, I find myself unable to say how to address them or answer them or how to decide them head on or directly. It seems that the way towards such questions seems also in the talk to go through the epistemological question and then sort of use whatever we get as an answer there as indicative of metaphysical conception. Now, at any rate, as was reported, the main philosophical area of interest for which the question of perceptual concept is taken, perceptual content or conceptual perception or not, is taken to be highly relevant as epistemology. To quote what we had on the last slide, if perception is conceptual, the epistemology of perceptual belief is just believing what we see. If it's non-conceptual, we need another model. Now, my suggestion is, and apologies from Pittsburgh, so I'm throwing sort of a nil type view at you. My suggestion is that we can have a model of the rational role of experience that is completely neutral between various views of the metaphysical nature of experience. If so, however, and unless we find a good way to address the metaphysical question directly, the question whether perceptual experience is conceptual loses much of its interest. So why do I think that we can have a common model on which it doesn't matter whether perceptual experience is or isn't conceptual? Now, all views of perception face issues, that's for sure. We know that acquaintance-based theories are shot through with issues having to do with the nature of acquaintance, its alleged epistemic role, and so on. Likewise, content accounts of perception, if wedded to the idea that we just pick up perceptual content as we form our perceptual beliefs, or there's some sort of inference, run into issues of how to make sense of the justificatory role of experience in the face of all sorts of top-down effects. So we then need to bring in extra conceptual tools and materials to deal with such cases, such as Susanna Siegel does, who then talks about the epistemic charge of experience, epistemic downgrading, and so on. However, the different kind of view that I have in mind is this, and again, surprise, it's modeled on Anil Gupta's conception of the rational role of experience. The basic point is this: let's not think that experience in and of itself can do anything for us. Instead, let's recognize that only if experience is combined with a background view, having such an experience makes it rational for one to transition to certain perceptual judgments or perform other actions. Now, if that's taken on board, all one needs to do now is tell a story about how experiences are rationally linked to transitions to perceptual judgments in other things in one's background view. Such that having an experience makes it so that it is then, upon having it, rational for one to engage in one of these transitions or others. However, and that's the important point really, one can run such an account if one thinks that experience has no content, is conceptual or non-conceptual, has content associated with it, or intrinsic concept. All these options are completely open to one. So in other words, if we assume with Gupta that the background view is really where the magic happens, the question whether or not perception has content or is conceptual and becomes, as it were, just a metaphysical one, where it doesn't seem to me that we can decide on it based on epistemological grounds, and where I then don't know how to decide about it. Yeah, so wrapping up, that's again where I am. My first question was methodological and just asked whether and why having an argument that's based on empirical evidence is particularly useful, great, good, to be preferred over armchair arguments. In particular, if we perhaps need to grant that ultimately the interpretation of these experiments throws us back to armchair considerations. My second question was a clarificatory question about the notion of concept in play, why we should accept it and why we should think that on the notion provided the empirical evidence cannot be brought in line with the claim that perceptual experience is conceptual. Given that on the notion of concept suggested, concepts are merely said to involve actual or potential cognition, which it seems to me opens up all sorts of ways in which the inference to the claim that perception is non-conceptual could be blocked. My third question was this: on an account of the rational role of experience, on which the role of experience is to make rational background relative transitions to perceptual judgments or other things, the question whether or not perceptual experience is conceptual loses much of its interest. If that's a bad view, perhaps it is, then I'd like to know why. But if not, why should we still be interested in the topic if we can't address the metaphysical question head on? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Block. I think your mic is muted. Yeah.
I was muted. Yeah. Thanks so much. Those are great. Those are great questions. So on the third point, I just don't see the point of. I don't see how Anil Gupta's theory really is relevant here. So we can have different models of how to justify perceptual belief. Bringing in the background and emphasizing how important the background is doesn't seem to me to do anything really. If you're interested, you see something red and you have the perceptual belief that something red is in front of you. What is the justification of that perceptual belief that there is something red in front of you? The background really is irrelevant. You have to somehow move from the perception of red to the belief that you see a red thing. One model is that a model that this is a case of reasoning. You reason from the perception of red to the belief that there's a red thing. The background doesn't do you any good. The background can have all kinds of stuff about colors and what you're likely to see. You've still got to move from the perception of red to the belief that there's a red thing. The reasoning account says the perception of red is a premise in reasoning, and the belief is a conclusion. What I'm saying is that model is no good because the perception can't be a premise. It doesn't have propositional form, and it doesn't have a kind of content that is suitable for being a premise because it's not conceptual. So my argument is that model's no good. You need another model, and I think Tyler Burge has suggested a model in which the perception grounds the belief. That's not a form of reasoning. So the issue, putting the term concept aside, the issue is perceptual justification a form of reasoning? My argument is that it isn't, and that is obviously a philosophically significant issue. On your first question, why do I think that non-armchair reasoning is better? Okay, I perhaps should have stated this more clearly. I'm not claiming that armchair reasoning is always worse than empirical reasoning. If we're talking about, for example, how do we move from P and Q to P, armchair is where it's at. That's logic. So we don't need anything empirical for that. I do think that the empirical plays a role. I think that principles of logic, we can imagine, and even Quine imagined that the principle of distribution of and over or might be refuted by quantum mechanics. So I do think that there is an empirical component even to logical reasoning. But I'm not making any blanket claim that the empirical is always better. In the case of non-conceptual perception, people have argued for many years that perception is non-conceptual, but the arguments were terrible. A lot of philosophers believe that perception is non-conceptual, but on no really good basis. The typical basis that people use is talking about animals. Animals have color perception without color concepts, supposedly. But how do we know they don't have color concepts? So, that was never justified from an empirical point of view. Actually, they didn't really have good evidence that animals had color perception even. So what I've got is a case where we have really good evidence for color perception in these infants of a certain age, and we have pretty good evidence that they don't have color concepts. And we have a pretty good evidence in adults that we don't have we don't have conceptual color perception either. Well, that maybe that's my answer. So one of the questions you asked was, I'm not sure if this is exactly your second question, but you pointed out the weakness of moving from absence of evidence to evidence of absence. And I agree that that is a terrible form of argument, but it's a pretty good empirical form if you have done a good enough search for forms of evidence. If you've spent years, and many psychologists have spent years looking at reasoning in young infants, and you get adequate reasoning having to do with shape, kind, and size, but not color, that's reason to think that without special training, the infants can't do reasoning with color. So I think that is although the form is not a terrific form, if you add in some premises like, are there other categories like of shape, kind, and size that work? And if they've looked at enough cases, then I think that the reasoning gets stronger. So another point that you made, maybe this is also part of your second point, is why use concept the way I'm using it? Now, I think I answered that in the talk. I don't want this to turn into a verbal issue. What I'm talking about is representations in thought and reasoning. Those are what I'm calling concepts. And the point here is that infants of this particular age do not use color representations in thought or reasoning. They do not normally use color representations in thought or reasoning. And my conclusion is that their color perception is not does not have this connection to thought and reasoning. That's without using the word concept, I can put it that way.
Thank you so much, Professor Block, for your response. Now we'll head to the question answer session. So you can the attendees can just use the raise hand function on Zoom. At Ashoka, we usually have a tradition of privileging questions by students first before those of professors. So apart from that, we'll just be following the order in which the questions do come up. So whoever has questions can raise their hands. Before I acknowledge Professor Saran, who's the only one whose hand is up right now, I would want to ask a question myself from Professor Block. Now, Professor, I wanted to ask you about the relationship between what we are calling color concepts and what would be what you would call a phenomenal consciousness, or the experience of seeing a particular color, right? Because I think earlier in the talk when you were talking about you had minimally defined concepts as it being something that involves a way of thinking. And right now, in response to Professor Rosenhagen's question, you spoke of it as something that has representations in thought and reasoning. So first, I think a more general question would be that would it be necessary to have some sort of concept in order for someone to have phenomenal consciousness? Because if they do, then what does the empirical evidence that you've presented in today's talk mean for phenomenal consciousness? Because then it opens the door for, is it possible to have the experience of seeing color without concepts? And if that is the case, then what is to be made of functional thesis, which says that if you just have the function of seeing, say a robotic eye or whatever, then you are pretty much that is the relevant state of conscious state or whatever.
Yeah, so the evidence for these infants having conscious color perception is pretty simple. I should say, by the way, it's very difficult, of course, to have any strong level of confidence about consciousness in nonverbal babies. But we do have some reason here, and that is that, first of all, the habituation studies I described show that when they keep seeing the same color, they stop looking. They're bored. They look at their feet. They lose interest. I don't know of any evidence that can occur in unconscious perception. Secondly, they look to a disc of a different color. So that suggests that they're interested in the different color. I know of no evidence that happens in unconscious perception. There's no. Those of you who know the literature on unconscious perception will know that it's very difficult to get a case of unconscious perception. So what many of us who believe that there is such a thing as unconscious perception have done is to move to arguments that there are conscious perceptions with unconscious aspects to them. But it's very hard to demonstrate unconscious perception. And I think there would, this is an empirical argument, so that's an area of empirical vulnerability, I guess. But somebody would need to provide some evidence that the perceptions of these infants are actually unconscious. I don't really think that there is much of a chance of that. I should say that I think that there can be concepts involved in unconscious mental processes, like unconscious reasoning. So I don't think that that a state or a mental process needs to be conscious in order to be conceptual.
Fair enough. Thank you so much, Professor. Professor Saurav, you may go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Dan, for a great talk. There was a lot of material that went by quite quickly. But one of the things I was struck by was that the difference between what you kept on emphasizing as being the normal case versus what happened when there was a certain amount of training involved. And I guess one of the things that I'm so a bit puzzled by with a lot of these empirical approaches is how we can be so sure about the upshot for mental architecture when it seems like there's this capacity question, right? Like about mental capacities and what they might be like with certain kinds of training, whatever they may be. And that just might change the parameters of how we think about what the mind can do. And I'm just wondering how you think of the relationship between these kinds of capacities, which might exhibit changes depending on training and depending on the environment, etc., and the upshot for mental architecture.
Yeah. So you said, how can we be so sure? And I take it that the thought behind that is, if we're really talking about the architecture of the mind, we need a better argument than the one that I've given. So, I know that philosophers sometimes are disappointed by the level of certainty in empirical reasoning, and especially when you're dealing with young children, there are lots of gaps and room for the results to be overturned. But that is just the way empirical reasoning is. There's going to be vulnerabilities. So instead of thinking, oh no, this empirical reasoning. So look, I interpret you as saying, I don't know, I'm not really satisfied by this empirical reasoning. There's so many openings for objections, etc. I'd rather go with the armchair. What I challenge you is to look at the armchair arguments for non-conceptual perception and compare them to this empirical argument. I find myself totally dissatisfied by the armchair arguments. I think they just make completely unjustified assumptions. So, as I said, the main argument is, animals have don't have color concepts, or don't have concepts at all. That's just
Yeah. No,
a
so sorry.
conclusion you could just reject.
Yeah, sorry. I wasn't I wasn't aiming to be skeptical in quite that way. It's not so. It's my worry is that we're focused a lot on what we can learn from the normal case, and we're sort of we're not too worried about what happens in these cases where there's a lot of training. The behavioral outcomes seem to be a bit different there, right? What I'm saying is, shouldn't if we're going to really take an empirical method, shouldn't we also be interested in, well, what's going on with those training cases and what we can learn from, there might be sort of dramatically different levels of performance exhibited after training. And I'm just wondering, like, what is the upshot of that for mental architecture as opposed to just, so it wasn't sort of like a dismissal of the empirical stuff at all. It's sort of a more, I'm worried that there's some data that we're ignoring, which might be relevant to how we think about the architecture of the mind.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, I'm sorry, I misinterpreted you. Look, I completely agree. I think that what happens with training is a really interesting question, and and I hope that somebody has pursued that issue. So I didn't mean to deny that would be really interesting. And in fact, in the data that I actually mentioned, there was something quite interesting, which is that until 9 months, the training doesn't transfer from red, green to blue, yellow. So you wonder what's going on there. They appear not. The training doesn't seem to be effective in getting them to pay attention to color per se. but just to specific colors. And that's a very odd thing. So something is happening in that ninth month, and I'd be very interested in finding out what it is. But I don't want to lose sight of the main point I was making, which is that there is this period between 6 months and 11 months old when, without training, they have color perception without color concepts. And if that description I just gave is right, that shows that they have non-conceptual color perception. So I don't want to lose sight of that. That's the key, the point. I'm still quite interested in what happens with training, but and it could turn out to be relevant, maybe not. I don't know.
Thanks.
Great. So before I acknowledge Professor Chopra, there's actually a question in the chat for Professor Block. So I'll just read it out. It's from Professor Behra, and now I'm reading the chat verbatim. Respected Professor Ned Block, I thank you for your thought-provoking talk. I am very much benefited by you. I would like to ask you that if our perception is non-conceptual, then perhaps our perception has no content. It is content-free perception. But the doubt is whether we perceive something or not. If yes, what exactly do we perceive?
Yeah, so this is a very big issue. And as Raja mentioned, there is a view according to which perception does not have content, the so-called naive realism view. So I'm not a fan of that view. Certainly, if you pay attention to perceptual, to vision science, which I do, that's very strongly committed to representational content. And I think there are quite a few issues that show that we need perceptual representational content in order to explain various things. That would be another talk, but it's a huge issue. And just for example, I don't think that these naive realist views can explain illusion. So it's very easy to explain illusion in representational terms. So if you are seeing a red thing and it looks green because of the lighting, the representational point of view just says you're visually representing it as green, even though it's red. And the naive realists have a difficulty explaining why a red thing should look green, given that their theory is that you're just directly connected to the thing you're seeing. So I would argue that that there are many reasons for being dissatisfied with these no content views.
Professor Chopra, you may go next.
Yeah, am I audible? Yeah. Yeah, hello, Professor Block. I just want to make few comments. One is that as I could get, you are making descriptions about sensation, like sensation of red color, but that is not perception. When we say perception of something, that is sensation with meaning and of an object, of an entity in the world. So I recall one situation that a person who is having a belief that a wild bear is roaming around in the jungle, in a forest, and suppose it is at the time of dusk. So there is some vague perception. Yes, that situation is there. And then the person may perceive a tent as a bear. And it has actually happened. And the person shot at this bear and some people got killed. So this is one thing. Another thing is there's a tribe, Tarahumara tribe. And this tribe, like we know in the Roche case, that a tribe, Dani tribe, which doesn't have different concepts for different colors, and still Eleanor Roche was able to show that they were able to make different, different perceptual judgments for different color pieces. That's fine. That's one extreme case. But again, in another case, but in the Tarahumara study, where they don't have different concepts for green color and for blue color. They have only one tag, which is SID name, something like this. Now, in this kind of tribe, when we show them hybrid colors like greenish blue or bluish green, so I mean the hybrid color which is more towards blue or more towards green, in the absence of color tags, they were not able to make distinctions between these two hybrids. So there is a role of concept or a different label in perception in such vague conditions. These are two situations I just described. And one more comment I want to make, that regarding color perception, naive realism is certainly wrong, because we know that when we perceive a color, it is not inherent in the body. It is what is interpreted in our, through our rods and cones. Color black is actually no color. It is absence of any frequency, any wave coming from that object. And suppose I have goggles, red goggles, and you make me see a green object, green color would be stopped by my goggles and I will see it black. So from this little bit of physics, we know that naive realism is certainly wrong regarding color perception, at least. Yeah, so these were certain comments. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks so much. So you made 3 points. So on the naive realism, I completely agree.
Yeah.
So your second point was
Tarahumara tribe.
Yeah, about the role of language. So you claim that if you don't have words for colors, you don't have concepts of the colors. I don't agree with that. So one example is that Greek and Russian have 2 words for shades of blue, where we have at least in English we have 1. We just have blue, but they have a word for light blue and another word for dark blue. But look, that's just whether you have a word for it, right? We can put a phrase together. I just did, light blue and dark blue. So I have a concept of the difference between light blue and dark blue, even though English doesn't have a word for it. And I think the same is true with these tribes you describe, that although they don't have words for colors, they have concepts of those colors that are non-linguistic. So, and they can reason about the colors, this color, that color. So I don't think that the absence of a word in their language means that they don't have any concept of the color.
No, my point is they didn't make distinction between hybrid colors with a difference of hue. I mean, if it is more greenish component as compared to blue, and otherwise like more bluish component than green. So in such a vague situation, not having differentiating concept does affect your perception. That was my point.
Okay, so we'd have to look at the details of the experiment.
Yeah.
So
sure.
My guess, I don't know how it was, what the evidence was supposed to be, that they couldn't, that it did affect their perception. Maybe it did. There's a lot of rather inconclusive evidence about to the extent to which cognition affects perception in the case of color. And it's much disputed. There's this phenomenon called memory color, where you may know about this, that a German group, Gegenfurtner's lab. Well, I won't go into it. But there is a lot of dispute about the extent to which cognition affects perception. But my guess would be that those people could distinguish conceptually between greenish blue and bluish green. using a phrase like greenish blue, or the hybrid colors, a color that is more greenish than bluish, we can put together a phrase that distinguishes between a color that is more greenish than bluish and a color that is more bluish than greenish. So you don't need the terms to be able to put together a concept there. So on the first point that you made about the distinction between sensation and perception, I agree very much that this is an important distinction. And there is a lot of dispute in the literature about exactly what it comes to. I like Tyler Burge's way of, well, I like it to some extent anyway, in terms of object. So he defines perception as objective sensory representation. So the idea is that what the difference between sensation and perception is a matter of the objectivity of the representation. And he distinguishes between senses like smell that may not be perceptual senses. And he talks about animals that just respond to different smells in a stimulus response kind of way. And he isolates the perceptual constancies as the key feature that distinguishes sensation from perception. So, so that I think that's a pretty good way of thinking about it.
Great.
Can I?
Professor Chopra, there's actually a question in the chat, so I'll have to attend to that first. Yes, so there is, wait, my bad, yes. So Professor Block, there's another question on chat from John Elias, and I'm reading the chat verbatim again. Dear Professor Ned Block, based on your presentation, how will you define sense data for non-conceptual perception?
I would ask what sense data are supposed to be. I mean, if they're supposed to be something you see, the traditional sense datum idea is that in perceiving a red fire hydrant, what you're really seeing is a sense datum that represents the red fire, or the color of the red fire hydrant. And, I know of no evidence for that view. I think you see the redness of the fire hydrant and you perceptually represent it. So I don't believe in sense data in that sense.
Fair enough. Do we have any more questions?
Can I ask one?
I think, yeah, Professor Chopra, go ahead.
Okay, this another comment. As Professor Block, you asked about it is hard to demonstrate unconscious perception. So on that, I'm commenting that I think it is, if we look at one commonsensical situation, that suppose we cross through a busy market, and after crossing a group of people for some 10 meters, we turn back after some time and we find that there is a friend in that group. So why do we take time? Because I think unconsciously we had perceived the face of our friend in that group of people, and it took some time to come to the surface of awareness, conscious awareness. So I think that can be a case of unconscious perception. What do you think?
I think there are two ways of thinking about what you just described. One way is what you said, unconscious perception of the friend's face that then becomes conscious. A second way is you consciously perceive the friend's face, but you didn't conceptually categorize it at a level that would allow you to notice it. So that would be a non-conceptual perception without the stimulation of a concept. And this dispute is very much involved in these debates about a phenomenon called change blindness. You may have heard of this. So one famous case, which I'm about to ruin for everybody, by by describing it. I'm sorry, but it's a famous case done by quite a few people, first done by Ulrich Neisser, but then done by Dan Simons, where you have a group of people wearing white shirts and a group of people playing black with black shirts, and they're tossing a basketball around between them. And subjects are instructed to count the number of passes between a white-shirted member and another white-shirted member, and to ignore the ones between people with black shirts. And they're supposed to come up with a number at the end of the video. And in the middle of the video, a gorilla, a very black dressed fake gorilla, of course not a real gorilla, walks across the screen, and a substantial number of the viewers don't see the gorilla. Oh, sorry, they don't notice the gorilla. So that, if that's the, now there's two views of this. One is they didn't consciously see the gorilla. The other view is that they did consciously see the gorilla, but they didn't categorize it as a gorilla, and so they didn't. As a result, they didn't notice that it was that a gorilla had walked across the screen. So this is now, and there's a big dispute. I personally think the evidence is very strong for having seen the gorilla, consciously seen it without noticing that it was a gorilla. And so I would use that as an analogy for the case you mentioned of seeing a friend, but not noticing that it was a friend until later. But as I said, this is a topic of much discussion under the category of so-called change blindness.
I think it is inattentional blindness. Change blindness is some
sorry.
other. It is inattentional.
You're right.
Yeah.
You're right. It's inattentional blindness. Yeah.
So, Ritam, you had a question?
Yeah, and thank you, Professor, for the talk. So I was just wondering, about the success of your arguments. Like, if I assume the success of your arguments, then I was wondering that, like, in the broader philosophical picture, like whether this kind of if I know that like the perception is like perception is like non-conceptual in case of children, then would it say anything about like broader problems in like philosophy of perception, like the hard problem of consciousness, or or anything about the easy problems as well? Like, what would be its broader philosophical implications in this kind of debates, or whether if it has any?
Yeah, so certainly there's no relevance that I can see anyway to the hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness is why does the neural basis of a given perceptual state, why is it the neural basis of that conscious perceptual state rather than a different one or none? I don't see any relevance to that, but it is relevant to the easy problems because it has to do with the function of conscious perception. So this traces out a certain aspect of function and suggests that you need you need concepts to have a function in generating expectations.
Professor Gruber, you can go next.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you for the inspiring talk in many ways. I just wanted to get back to when I raised my hand. That was the moment when a friend walking past coming by, and a few seconds later, be it 3 or 5 or 7, and this is going to be important in a moment. So it's not change blindness, and I don't think it's inattentional blindness because we go back to it. So my understanding of both kinds of blindness, but I'm not an expert on those, would be that we don't see it. And the gorilla you only see when you pay attention to the gorilla, not to the black or white shirts. But what I wanted to get back to is this few seconds window, and whether this is where my research comes in. whether the realizing after, say, maybe 3 seconds that you did see a friend. So I do auditory research on timing and rhythm, and there's this, purpose-based window of the felt presence, the now, of about 3 seconds, where something that is happening can still affect what just happened before, although it's already being processed in the, auditory, visual, whichever cortex after a few hundred milliseconds. So I just immediately wondered whether this realization a few seconds later that he did see a friend is part of that window of now. Do you think there's any relation? Am I making any sense, or?
Yeah, you're making sense, but certainly from the work in vision, I would say it's too long for there to be any kind of perceptual integration with the later and the earlier. So masking experiments suggest that the maximum window is around 800 milliseconds. So if you want a later perception to be integrated with an earlier one, once you get beyond, once the second stimulus is 800 milliseconds later or more, it doesn't happen. And in fact, many perceptual integration experiments show the maximum results around 200 milliseconds. Perhaps you're familiar with the cutaneous rabbit. That's a terrific perceptual integration phenomenon. So the way this works is you have the person's arm and you put clappers on the wrist and midpoint here and then on the elbow. Sometimes they have one further up the arm too. So what you find is that if you do 5 taps here, and then 5 taps here, and then 5 taps here, the person experiences the second tap as not here, but here. And the third tap is here, and so on. So it feels to the person as if a rabbit is running up their arm. And so the explanation of it is that there is integration of the taps, in the intermediate place taps with the earlier ones, but if it's much beyond 200 milliseconds between taps, it doesn't happen. So they can gauge. The second stage has to be 200 milliseconds. Works best with 200 milliseconds after the very first one. So many people have described this as retrodiction. That is, the later tap predicts the earlier experience. But really what it is perceptual integration of the sort you're talking about. And so I don't know, maybe the auditory system is different. Maybe it has longer term integration than the visual.
Yeah, thank you. Interestingly, sorry, I do know that experiment, but in the auditory sense. So if you have 3 or 5 clicks here and here, the person hears them as tuk, 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 tuk. But that is a lot faster. So interestingly, that's what I want to say. The integration window of the felt now is like 3 seconds, but the 1, 2, 3 here and 1, 2, 3 there, and you hear it as going around the room. That's a lot faster. So the auditory system is kind of faster and has a longer window of now at the same time. So thank you for telling me about the rabbit in bringing visual and tactile and auditory together. So there's, it'll be interesting to look at that in a cross-modal sense, I think. As far as I know, there doesn't seem to be a correlation between, this is another consciousness timing switching, the rate of switching, and by the rabbit duck illusion or the face illusion. So there's apparently no correlation between that and the auditory sense of now, but who knows? Maybe that can be looked at further. Okay.
Would you send me a reference to the auditory phenomena you mentioned?
Sure. it's yeah, it's Dan Phillips. I'll send it to you. My pleasure.
Okay, great.
Thank you for letting me speak.
Great. Professor, we also have a couple of questions in the chat. I think I'll probably read them out together, but like I hope like you have time right now.
Sure.
Yeah, so these are like two questions. I'm clubbing them as one. One is from Professor Alex Watson. His question is, and I quote, I would be interested to hear whether you agree with Navneet Chopra's contention that naive realism must be incorrect with regard to color perception, because we know through psychophysics that color does not belong to objects, but rather arises as a result of the contact of light waves on the retina. And the second question, or like, should I? I'll read the.
Why don't we just do one at a time?
Fair enough.
Yeah. So I didn't think that was Professor Chopra's argument, but I don't agree with that argument. Look, I think it's easiest to discuss if you say if you take the view that objects really do have colors, even if the explanation has to do with light waves and the interaction with the visual system. Because naive realism, look, if you say that objects don't have colors, naive realism is automatically wrong, because the naive realist view is that what it is to perceive red is to be in some kind of direct awareness contact with the redness in the outside world. If there's no redness in the outside world, then naive realism is immediately wrong, so you've just refuted it. So that seems to me to be a rather cheap form of refutation. So yeah, I don't really, look, I'm an opponent of naive realism, but I think that's just too easy.
Yeah, and the second question is from Bungarithian Jajo. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And their question is, quote, Professor Block, if possible, can you please explain about what representation really is? After reading some naive realist papers, Travis et al., I'm confused what representation is in perception. I hope this question is not too preliminary. I'll be thankful.
So interestingly, Travis's view is that there is representation in the visual system, but only unconsciously. So he's happy to say that in the processing of visual information, there are representational states. Now, the problem with that view, look, first of all, what does it mean? It means that the states have accuracy conditions. What it is for the state to be a state that represents red is accurate just in case there is something red that the person is seeing. So I don't think there's any mystery about what representation means. There can be disagreement about whether you really are representing things. So Travis agrees that in unconscious perception, you are visually representing. He just thinks that it's not the way that it's not true of conscious perception. But that makes it a mystery how an unconscious percept can become conscious. So there are some great experiments where you can create what I would regard as an unconscious perception, but probably the most dramatic one, which actually I could do right here and now if I had distributed red and green glasses. I do this in a class. So if you get the people in the class to put on these red-green glasses, and you can then use those to funnel stimuli to each eye separately. And if you have a very rapidly moving multicolored stimulus in one eye, the subject that dominates perception, and what's in the other eye is not consciously perceived. And that can be, for example, a face. But interestingly, the expression on the face is relevant to whether it is consciously perceived. So a scared face is more likely to be consciously perceived than a neutral face. And in fact, there's an initial period where whatever kind of face it is not seen consciously, and the scared face breaks through into consciousness faster. Now, I don't see how you can explain that except by saying that a representation, which was first an unconscious representation, becomes a conscious representation. But that requires talking about conscious representations, which goes contrary to Travis's view.
Yeah. So since we are like nearing the end of the talk, I think I would probably want to pose one final question, considering that we don't have any other questions from the attendees. Professor, I would like to know what your response would be to the following claim, if someone is to make that claim. The claim being that color perception is required for color concept, considering that we in the empirical evidence that we've seen that color perception is something that infants and also, as you propose, that adults have like non-conceptual color perception. So, and the reason I think this is a question that someone could ask, or is coming in my head rather, is because perception seems to be like something which is always temporally in the immediate. Like I am perceiving something presently. I can't perceive something that happened in the past. I can have a memory of that, but I can't perceive it presently. While a concept for anything, right, a representation in thought can be about like something in the past or even the future, right? Like, I mean, if an expectation of color, if I have to talk strictly about color there, so to speak. So given that this is like a difference that I see between what perceptions are and what concepts are, is it possible for people to have color perception, like color concepts without color perception? Do they need at least one instance of color perception to be able to have color concepts? Say someone who was not born blind, but then later on becomes blind, they might still have some color concepts in their brain versus someone who's born blind. So would they have like, so just that relationship, if you could explain a bit.
Yeah, so look, the term concept is somewhat vague, and I don't know that there is a factual answer to this. What I would say is that if you become blind now, you certainly have color concepts. You retain those color concepts. For one thing, you could, if you become blind because of a problem in your eyes, you still have color imagery. So the color imagery might be enough to give you the color concept. But also, I think that people who are congenitally blind and may perhaps have no color imagery also can have color concept to some extent. Maybe they're not full color concepts, but they can certainly reason about colors. Yeah, one of the experiments I didn't show was, well, I won't go into it because I'd have to describe the experiment. But yeah, so I think that I think that there's no clear answer to this because of some looseness in how to, in how good your color concepts are. Maybe they have some perceptual requirement of some sort, or at least an imagery requirement.
Fair enough. Great. I think we can call it a wrap. Thank you so much, Professor Block. It's been an honor to be in attendance for this talk and to also be the moderator while at it. I'm sure like the attendees of this talk, like me, have found this to be a very engaging and a very like intellectually stimulating talk. And I thank you so much for your time.
Oh, well, I want to thank you all, and it was a great question period. It was interesting to me, and yeah. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Professor. And also, since this is the final talk of the workshop, I think we can call it a wrap for the workshop, which we've been calling Locating Subjectivity in the Study of Consciousness. And I think this is probably my moment to give a brief vote of thanks, which I've not prepared at all. But yeah, I want to just thank all the speakers who have graciously accepted our invitation. Professor Daniel Stolja, Professor Robert Howell, and of course you, Professor Block. And I want to also thank all the faculty members of the Department of Philosophy who have just been kind in their support. Specifically Professor Rosenhagen, who is also my thesis advisor and who told me to do this as part of my research practicum. I am very glad that I got the opportunity to organize this, and thank you so much to all the attendees who have graced us with their presence. With that, I think that's the end for the workshop, and hopefully see you soon, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Sankar. Excellent job. Really well done.
Yeah, I thought so too. Yeah. Sorry, I couldn't come to the other talks. It was in the middle of the night here.
I'll be sending you the recordings, Professor Block, so in case.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Thanks
Okay,
very
bye-bye.
much. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.